So going to Revelation chapter 7, look what the text says. After this, I saw 4 angels. Now, the after this is important to understand. He's not saying after chapter 6. Neither is he saying after the seals are opened. What he's saying is after this prophetic revelation. It's another way of putting a pause in the text because it becomes very obvious right away. When you read the text, there's a group of people that are being sealed and protected from the very judgments that are opened in the first, second, third, and fourth seals. Before the first, second, third, and fourth seals are even opened, God sends a certain protection. So then we know it's not chronological. This is a background. This is a filler. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on earth or in sea or against any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun, that would be the east, with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the earth and sea, saying, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Now we're going to pause there and we'll talk about who they are in a second. And it's important to understand that this terminology is not coming from a vacuum. This concept of the 4 winds carrying the judgment of God is an Old Testament concept, and it's an ancient Near Eastern understanding. We see it in Zechariah, and I've highlighted Zechariah earlier in our teaching on Revelation. In Zechariah chapter 6, there are also 4 horsemen, though they're different colors. But what is the same with Revelation is they're 4 horsemen, they're 4 winds, and they're bringing God's judgment. Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1. Again I lifted my eyes and saw, and behold, 4 chariots came out from between 2 mountains. The mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the fourth was dappled, all of them strung. Now notice the colors don't line up exactly with Revelation. However, verse 4, then I answered and said to the angel who talked with me, what are these, my Lord? And the angel answered and said to me, these are going out, now catch the words, to the 4 winds of heaven. That'd be the 4 compass points, north, east, west, and south. It's an understanding. It's an ancient Near Eastern understanding. We still have the same compass points, but we know the world is round. I hope you know the world is round. If you don't know the world is round, get off of Google and leave alone the flat earth people. The earth is round, but we do use north, east, west, and south. The angel answered and said to me, these are going out to the 4 winds of heaven after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth. And so what they're doing is they're coming in and bringing God's judgment. That is the same. Go to Daniel chapter 7. I've talked about the book of Daniel before, especially when we were doing our Daniel flyover before Revelation. And in Daniel 7, chapter 2, Daniel declares, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, catch the language, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And then 4 beasts came out of the sea. Now, Daniel is talking about the period of the Revelation. All I want you to do is notice the terminology is very similar to what John will use. And then go to Jeremiah chapter 49. This is the last place I'll take you to make this point, but I'm making it for a reason, which I'll explain in a second. Jeremiah chapter 49, and it's going to be verse 36. Again, I'm sure you read that this morning in your devotional. And here, God is talking about judging one of Israel's enemies, Elam. But look at the terminology. And I will bring upon Elam the 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven. And I will scatter them to all those winds, and there shall be no nation to which those driven out of Elam shall not come. So here what we have, again, is the 4 winds. They represent judgment from God. And this judgment is sent from heaven, and it's directed to the earth. That's exactly what we see in the book of Revelation. We see these 4 winds, 4 angels, and it's not hard to go back and think, wait a second, we had 4 seals, and each one represented a judgment. There was the Antichrist, there was war, there was famine, there was then death of all the earth. There was a white horse, there was a red horse, there was a black horse, and there was a pale horse. And before all that death and destruction, apparently, John sees another angel. That's verse 2. And it's ascending from the rising of the sun. That's the east. Now, the east is where the Messiah will come from. It doesn't always have a messianic connotation to it, but you wouldn't expect an angel coming from God, coming from the west. He always would come from the rising of the sun. It comes with the wings of the dawn, so to speak. And we know that this is an angel that's sent from God because he's got the seal of God, like the seal of the President of the United States. This is the seal of the living God. And he calls out in a loud voice to those other destroying angels. Remember, these commands in heaven are resulting in catastrophes on planet Earth. Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of God on their foreheads. So there is this pause in the action before the first 4 seals when God says, don't do anything yet. I'm going to seal my people. Now, let me take a pause there just for a second because we're about to go into who these people are. But just the concept of God's control and God's sealing is very important. And I want to draw an analogy. I'm not saying this is what Revelation is talking about. I'm drawing an analogy. The analogy is to the sealing of the Holy Spirit that we in the church receive. We're told that the Holy Spirit, and look in Ephesians chapter 1, where the Holy Spirit is a seal for us. He's a deposit. He's guaranteeing our inheritance. It's a kind of a spirit. If you had spiritual goggles, you'd be able to look and say, oh, that one belongs to Jesus and that one belongs to Jesus. For us, it is a seal of salvation, of the security of our salvation. It is a seal of God's promise. It's a seal of God's pledge. It's a seal of God's ownership. And it's a seal of God's authority, which is how seals were used in the first place. In the ancient Near East, they used to take hot wax seals and they would stamp it with an owner's hot wax or cylindrical seal is what it used to be. And it would show ownership, it would show authority. And so this is the concept of these seals. God seals us as well. Now, I think in part that's really important to remember because I've been building this whole argument that the things that we see on this planet is not all of reality. And so when you went to the Avengers movies and you saw the DC comics and you've been watching all of these flicks about superheroes, guess what? That was created in the minds of people like Stan Lee. But there's a partial truth to it. There really is a spiritual reality beyond what we can see. There really is a spiritual war. And it's not between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi. It's between God himself and Lucifer, the angel who rebelled. It's against the forces of God and the forces of the devil, but they don't have bodies. They're spirit beings. You can't put a Geiger counter to them, but they're very real and they're very active. And so in Revelation, more and more we're going to see the veil between heaven and earth is going to be torn away, and we're going to be able to see the things that happen on earth or the things that happen in heaven. And so at this point, I just wanted to comment on these seals, that in an analogous way, we're sealed by the Holy Spirit. We belong to God. We carry the authority of God, and we're protected by God. So here we see that there's 144,000 from the tribes of Israel who are sealed by God, who cannot be hurt by these 4 judgments that begin with the breaking of the seals by the Lamb. Now that raises another question. Is it Israel? Is it a stand-in for the church? Are there all the tribes? Do they get martyred? What's their job? There's a lot of literature on this. So let's pile it away. Israel is not the Gentiles. Israel is not the church. Israel has promises that have yet to be fulfilled. Zechariah 12, they will look on the Messiah and they will weep over the one that they have pierced. And so now we see that there's 12,000, and it repeats almost ad nauseum, 12,000 from each of the tribes of Israel. You wouldn't say that if you weren't really talking about Israel. So there's 12,000 from Judah. That's the first of the tribes because of the special place of Judah in Jacob's prophecies. Remember Jacob in Genesis 49, around verse 10, he prophesies that the scepter won't depart from Judah. He'll be a roaring lion. 12,000 from Judah. And then Reuben, who is actually the firstborn. Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Now, a sharp reader would say, wait a second. I didn't see Dan. What happens to Dan? And another sharp reader would say, hey, wait a second. Manasseh, that's not one of the 12 tribes. In fact, Ephraim and Manasseh were sons of Joseph. So why is Joseph listed there and his son Manasseh, but not Ephraim? And why did Dan drop out? Now, I got good news for you. Nobody knows. But there are maybe 30 different listings of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they're not all the same for whatever reason. Maybe it's lost to us at this point, but there were 12 tribes, and that included ones that are often left out, Joseph and Levi. Sometimes Levi's left out because they didn't get a land inheritance. Joseph is sometimes left out because his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, get a whole hunk of land, and so they're usually listed and somebody else drops out. What's really important to know is there are 12 tribes, no matter how they're listed, and each one gets 12,000 people. That screams to me this is a fulfillment of God's covenants to Israel, because Israel's not the Gentiles and Israel's not the church. So during this tribulation time, Israel will recognize its Messiah. They will individually turn to Jesus as the Messiah, and they will be protected. Now, what they do has a lot of debate. And some say that they are evangelists for the tribulation, but really nowhere does it actually say that. So let's just leave that to your study. But they do show up again in chapter 14. And so rather than deal with it then, I'll deal with it now. Revelation 14, there John gives us some characteristics of this 144,000, besides the fact that they're Jewish. I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000, who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. Now it's the same people as Revelation 7. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. And the voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they were singing a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and before the elders. Remember, follow the songs in heaven. They're very important. And they carry the narrative along and sometimes the theology. In this case, who's singing a new song? No one could learn the song. That's interesting. No one could learn the song except for the 144,000. Think about that for a while. We just kind of think, oh, sing a song, have a chorus, 4 verses, always drop the third one out. Everybody can learn this. There's something about the resonance of this music, this song, that is imprinted on this 144,000 that is very unique. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Now, that creates a bit of a sticky wicket. It's like they'd been redeemed. Okay, they found Jesus, they accepted him, but did they get martyred? Or weren't they sealed? Weren't they protected? Well, some would say they were sealed to be eternally saved, but not necessarily physically saved. I have to throw up my hands at this point because I don't think it's clear enough to say. I suspect that they are physically as well as spiritually protected, and that redeemed has to do with the fact that they found Jesus. But I'm not going to fight somebody over that interpretation. It is these who have not yet, and this is why. Verse 4, is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Now, the defiling, don't get offended at that. This is military terminology. And when Israel would go to war, part of their sanctification, or their consecration is a better way to put it, was that they were to abstain from sexual relations with women because they knew they were fighting alongside of angels. I don't understand it, but it's in all the literature. And so not being defiled by women it sort of shows their consecration unto the Lord. They're married to Jesus, so to speak. That's the imagery. And they're engaged in a very particular heavenly or earthly role, but very particularly with the Lamb, with Jesus. It is those who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. Now, that could be in the kingdom, which we'll see when we talk about that at the end of Revelation. It could be during the 1,000-year reign, could be forever. Again, text is not clear enough, but it does say they're his special people. They follow him. These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. So we know something about them. We know that they're assigned particularly to Jesus. Only they belong to that club because they all sing the same song. They are consecrated to Jesus as their husband, so to speak, in all of its spiritual implications. And there is no lie, and they are blameless. So beyond that, the text doesn't really say anything else. I would say, however, it's important to understand that they are literally Israel, and this is part of the fulfillment of God's covenants to Israel. And it's very important to keep Israel separate from the nations and Israel separate from the church. Now that brings us to the rest of chapter 7, where all the rest of the nations show up, but in this case, as martyrs.